I'm pregnant. The doctor says it's triplets. In the hospital, a faceless alpha cradled their stomach. Ella jolted awake, gasping, sheets tangled around her. Sunlight flooded her cramped bedroom. No hospital. No pregnant alpha. Just the hum of life outside thin walls, distant voices, bouncing balls, wind chimes. She collapsed back, forearm over her eyes. What a deranged nightmare. Probably residual trauma from that academy confession. In this era, everyone presented their secondary gender around 18. Until then, you were just potential. ABO ruled supreme. Female alphas and male alphas? Same gender. Ella had presented late, barely a week before graduation. Her official test results were still pending, but obviously she was alpha. Pre-presentation, she'd pinned alphas twice her size. Post-presentation? Demolished them. First same-gender propositions, now male alpha pregnancy dreams? Psychological warfare. Knock knock. Ella? Up yet? Her sister's voice. 7 a.m. Shit. Normally she'd have finished her morning run by now. Damn nightmare. Coming. Military-honed efficiency had her dressed and out in 90 seconds. The living room resembled a sentient carpet, fluffy alien, pets rolled underfoot. Zelda, lacing her boots, scratched one with her free hand. Go check if sister's awake, sweetie. Ella groaned. Stop corrupting their tiny brains with fake family trees. The creature, a Tribble-esque fluff ball from last decade's pet craze, nuzzled her ankle. Others swarmed, burying her feet in pastel fur. Zelda kept rescuing these abandoned genetic experiments. Their cramped apartment now housed 14. Ella couldn't complain much. She'd been a street kid Zelda rescued too. But boundaries mattered. Which of you little shits ate my socks last week? She mock glared. Want a spin in the dryer? The herd scattered, quivering behind Zelda. Her sister shot her the look. Dryer incident? Tastiest croissant ever. Ella crammed breakfast into her mouth. Zelda inspected each fluff ball before relenting. You're escorting me to the exotic pet rescue? Nope. You've got bigger plans today. Zelda's smile turned dangerous. Bigger than saving bioengineered tribbles? You have a blind date today. Ella choked on pastry. Blind date? Me? I graduated yesterday. Perfect timing. Zelda beamed. No academic distractions. You've been planning this. Even if we have to do this, why now? Ella tried one last protest. Your compatibility rating is off the charts, Zelda insisted. Ratings. So her sister had uploaded her data to a matchmaking grid. High synergy matches are 1 in a million, Zelda pleaded, eyes bright. This could be your cosmic soulmate. Only you believe in cosmic anything. Ella muttered. Zelda's stare sharpened, wide doe eyes turning accusatory. Ella caved. Fine. I'll meet my fated disaster. Orphaned at 7, raised by this Omega who'd scraped credits to keep them fed, how could she refuse? Zelda's guilt-tripping gaze worked better than any alpha's command pheromone. One meeting. If they bail, it's biology, not my fault. Impossible. You're perfect. Perfect? Their cramped, dim apartment with peeling stars cape wallpaper begged to differ. Poverty zones didn't produce primates. Ella's 5-year plan had no room for bonding contracts or nesting subsidies. Not until Zelda's rescue critters slept in heated pods instead of repurposed ration boxes. But arguing was futile. Time for strategic compliance. Let me accessorize. She backed toward her room. Send the coordinates. Just be yourself. Zelda kissed her cheek and herded fuzzballs out the door. No running away. 12 p.m. sharp. Ella saluted mock seriously. Lieutenant Ella reporting for love duty. Zelda snorted laughter, hugging each fluff ball goodbye before slipping into the smoggy morning. Alone in her room, Ella stared at her reflection. How to politely repel an Omega in 10 minutes flat. She rummaged through her closet, mostly military uniforms, but Zelda has a make Ella pretty purchases. Black lace, leather, chains emerged. Ella grinned at the mirror. Time to weaponize subculture. She pieced together the most memorable outfit possible. Black tank top, red and black plaid suspender dress, black leather miniskirt, silver metal necklace, metallic belt, black stockings, black leather boots, topped with an oversized red coat. Perfect. Subculture inherently represents niche and non-mainstream tastes, rejected by the majority, enough to scare most people off. Ella changed into the outfit and checked herself in the mirror. Still not enough. Ella had a strikingly beautiful face. Even in the military academy environment where she never wore makeup and lived roughly, her looks stood out. Once, a fellow Alpha cadet had confessed to her. Being propositioned by the same gender wasn't something to boast about. For most Alphas, it felt like a provocation. Ella had ample experience dealing with such challenges. She invited the cadet to the combat arena. The outcome was her decisive victory, preserving her prized single status. Though afterward, for some reason, challengers kept multiplying. The mirror reflected a face of sharp, aggressive beauty. Her straight black hair clashed with the outfit. Too disjointed. The clothes screamed nonconformity, but her face? All classic military elegance, the kind featured in recruitment ads. Her hairstyle and makeup needed adjustments. But with her military deployment next month, rainbow hair wasn't an option. After consideration, she settled on subtle streaks, easily dyed back later. Ella ordered a cheap semi-permanent dye via terminal. Delivery drones arrived within 10 minutes, even in her slum district. Following a tutorial, she dyed crimson streaks into her hair. While waiting, she applied bold, smoky eyeshadow and painted her nails neon. Finally, she washed her hair, blow-dried it, curled the ends, and braided a section tied with a scarlet ribbon. Done. The mirror now showed someone unrecognizable, garish makeup, clashing colors, rebellious attire. A delinquent replacing the disciplined cadet. Yet still beautiful. The exaggerated style amplified her striking features instead of masking them. This should work. Unmistakably non-mainstream. If her sister questioned it later, she'd claim personal preference. By the time she finished, morning had slipped away. Checking the terminal, the address froze her, capital star, 1st District, Eternal Ocean. 1st District, Eternal Ocean. Translation: astronomically expensive. Her slum sector home in District 13 meant public transit wouldn't cut it. Too late to back out now. Gritting her teeth, she hailed a private air taxi. Marriage ruins wallets. Even burns credits before it starts. Eternal Sea was a star-rated hotel famous across the Federation, located on the east side of Zone 1. When Ella stepped off the aircraft, the first thing she saw was a grand structure shaped like a spaceship. Maybe it really was a spaceship that had been converted into a hotel. She could almost see the star coins in her account growing wings and flying away. It wasn't like she was completely broke. The annual stipend and bonuses from the military academy were quite generous, and she occasionally took on private jobs to earn extra money. But maintaining mechas and buying equipment was expensive. And she was stingy. She also had to support her sister's freeloading second brother, and all the little furballs her sister had picked up. Ella sighed heavily in her heart. She raised her wrist and checked the time, almost noon. She decided to go in and take a look. 2 rows of guards stood at the hotel entrance. Their posture was upright, their gazes sharp. It was obvious they had undergone strict training. Ella glanced at them. Something about them felt familiar, like soldiers from the military. Perhaps they were retired soldiers hired at security. Not an unusual thing. Ella dismissed her curiosity and walked forward. The leading guard stepped up as if to stop her. Then, his gaze landed on Ella's face, and a hint of doubt crossed his expression. He looked at her, then lowered his head to check the terminal on his wrist. His eyes suddenly widened in shock, as if he had just seen a ghost. It was unclear what kind of internal struggle the guard went through. In the end, he stepped forward and asked hesitantly, as if testing the waters. "Excuse me, are you Miss Ella?" "Yes," Ella replied. The guard's expression became even stranger. His gaze lingered on her face for several seconds before he finally forced out, "Mr. Swift has been waiting for you for quite some time. Please follow me." "Oh, Swift." Ella suddenly realized she had forgotten to ask her sister for the name of her blind date. Not that it really mattered. She followed the guard into the spaceship-shaped hotel. The entire place was eerily quiet. Other than the station guards, there wasn't a single person in sight. So empty. No customers at all. The food here must be terrible. Definitely a place that rips off rich fools. As one of those soon-to-be ripped-off fools, Ella felt rather depressed. Maybe she should discuss changing locations with this Mr. Swift. Or perhaps she could just meet him and leave right away, skipping the meal entirely. It might leave a bad impression, but her wallet was more important than her reputation. As she stepped into the elevator, Ella felt a faint spatial fluctuation. Before she could fully process it, the elevator doors opened. A long, metallic corridor stretched before her. The guard led her through the corridor and stopped before a heavy alloy door. He stepped aside and said, "Mr. Swift is inside." Ella paused for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark and silent. It looked like some kind of themed suite. Following the faint glow of scattered lights, Ella walked forward. Turning a corner, she was suddenly met with a dazzling sight. A massive floor-to-ceiling window revealed the boundless ocean of stars beyond. Ella's eyes widened in astonishment. This was space. No wonder she had sensed spatial fluctuations earlier. No wonder this hotel dared to call itself the Eternal Sea. The only true Eternal Sea was this vast universe. The hotel structure on the ground was merely a transit station. Its real body was in outer space. But Ella quickly lost interest in admiring the starry expanse outside the window. Sitting alone by the window was a cold-faced male Omega? Probably an Omega. Ella wasn't too confident in her ability to judge gender. Alpha pheromones were said to trigger resistance and aversion in others of the same sex, but Ella had never truly experienced that herself. Though, when alphas were drenched in sweat after training, they did smell awful, bad enough to make her want to humanely exterminate them all. As for omega pheromones, popular descriptions always portrayed them as sweet and irresistibly attractive, capable of driving alphas in heat into a frenzy. She had never felt anything like that before and had always thought those descriptions were exaggerated. But now, she sensed a faint scent coming from the omega in front of her. It wasn't something she picked up through smell, it was deeper, something beyond the physical senses. The omega sitting against the backdrop of the starry sea had short, neat black hair, sharp and handsome features, and a cold, serious demeanor. His side profile was angular and striking, undeniably good-looking. And, oddly familiar. When she arrived, Mr. Swift had been busy working. Several holographic screens floated in front of him. His gloved right hand rested on the desk while his bare left hand tapped at the screens. His lips were pressed into a firm line, his expression focused to the point of rigidity. Cold, serious, left-handed, seemed like he might have a bit of a cleanliness obsession. And he was in great shape. Even with his formal attire covering him from head to toe, it was clear that he wasn't thin or frail. His chest was broad and well-defined, firm beneath the fabric. Realizing it was rude to focus so much on an omega's physique, Ella quickly averted her gaze. By then, Mr. Swift had already closed his screens and stood up to look at her. "Ella, Captain?" His gaze lingered on her face for a brief moment before he finished her title. There was no additional lighting in the cabin, but the radiant glow of the nebula outside the ship was more than enough for them to see each other clearly. For a split second, his expression went blank, puzzled, even. His eyes clearly held confusion, but he quickly concealed his emotions, pretending nothing was out of the ordinary. As if it were completely normal for an officer to dress like a delinquent in private. Ella's expression stiffened the moment she heard him call out her rank. The perfect mask she had put on cracked ever so slightly. She had graduated from the Capital Military Academy. Most graduates from the academy were granted the rank of junior officer, typically second lieutenant, with exceptional students earning first lieutenant instead. Ella was a special case. She had earned merit during an assessment mission and was promoted directly to captain. Clearly, he had done his research on her beforehand. Well, that made sense. Looking up basic information before a blind date was normal. The odd one out here was her, who hadn't even known his name. Ella quickly recalled what she looked like right now. Streaked hair, smoky eye makeup, rebellious fashion, bright red nails, a full delinquent aesthetic. Sorry, alma mater. Sorry, military. Sorry, Federation. Ella covered her face in her mind. But since she was already here, the act had to go on. Mr. Swift. Ella forced a smile and briefly shook the hand he extended toward her. His hand was long-fingered and beautiful, but it felt nothing like the soft, smooth hands she associated with Omegas. It was stronger, firmer. Even though he didn't apply any pressure, she could feel the strength beneath the surface. There were calluses on his knuckles and the base of his thumb, a rough texture under her touch. As she withdrew her hand, Ella subconsciously rubbed her fingers together. She had the same kind of calluses, marks left from years of handling firearms. Ella felt a flicker of doubt. Her gaze landed on the man's sharp, composed face. Still, that nagging sense of familiarity wouldn't go away. But she couldn't quite place him. She was certain she hadn't met him in real life before. An Omega this striking, if she had seen him even once, she would never forget. Regardless, this was not someone she should be getting too involved with. Ella didn't deny that there was a certain pull between them, but she knew it was just biological attraction, a result of their high compatibility. Genetic and physiological attraction was the most unreliable thing. It led people to make mistakes, to fall into temptation, only to end up with deep regret. It was better not to start at all. As Ella was lost in thought, Alex was also observing and assessing her. Strikingly beautiful and intense features, bold red lips and dazzling nails, a highly individualized style, sharp and bright eyes full of vitality, and Alex's gaze lingered for a moment on the red strands in the alpha's hair. At first, he had assumed it was a hair tie. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was dyed. The military didn't have strict grooming regulations regarding soldiers' hair, and the academy was the same. Long hair was allowed, but dyeing and perming it was like dancing under the instructors' noses. Alex thought for a moment before speaking. Captain Ella is not quite what I imagined. Oh, am I prettier or cooler? Ella deliberately asked. Alex cleared his throat and answered. Both. Ella suddenly felt like she had just teased an innocent Omega. Would you like something to drink? As Alex spoke, a holographic menu automatically unfolded in front of her. Ella browsed through it, frowning slightly. It wasn't that the prices were too high, it was that there were no prices at all. That made choosing even harder. Every item on the menu looked like it would ambush her wallet. Plain water seemed the safest choice, but that wouldn't fit her persona. Would a rebellious cool girl order plain water? Of course not. Smoking, drinking, and wild hairstyles, that was what fit the role. Ella hesitated for a long time before finally choosing a drink that didn't seem too much like a financial assassin. It wasn't until after she placed the order that she realized, wasn't she supposed to be persuading Swift to pick a different place? How did she end up ordering instead? A mistake. Ella glanced up at the cold and handsome Mr. Swift across from her. Damn, beauty was dangerous. A small, disc-shaped robot flew in, delivering the drink Ella had ordered. Along with it was the tea Alex had ordered. In the pure white teacup, there were only a few scattered tea leaves. It was barely different from plain water. Ella, noticing her gaze, Alex picked up his tea and explained, I'm not used to drinks with strong flavors. I only drink light tea or plain water. Ella, you could have said that earlier. If you had, I wouldn't have struggled so much over my persona. Feeling a little frustrated, Ella took a sip of her drink. The taste wasn't bad. Acceptable, but still painful on the wallet. Setting her glass down, Ella said, Let's cut to the chase. A blind date wasn't like a romantic encounter. It was more direct, more goal-oriented. On the way here, Ella had looked up the most commonly asked but most off-putting questions at blind dates. Do you have a car? A house? How much is your salary? How many family members do you have? Why are you single? How many relationships have you had before? The rapid-fire questions were so sudden that even Alex didn't react right away. He froze for a few seconds, as if just now realizing why he was sitting here. The person sitting across from him was his compatibility match. He was on a blind date with a young military academy graduate who was much younger than him. A trace of discomfort flickered across Alex's face, but he still answered each question one by one. I have a car. I have a house. Salary. I will compile a summary of my personal assets for your review. Oh! Personal assets. That sounded like a lot of money. But that wasn't the point. The point was, I have nothing. Ella put on a shameless look. No car, no house. I live with my older siblings in the slums. No job, no salary, I live off my family. Alex nodded, unsurprised. It was only when he heard the last part that he added, Once you officially join the military, a captain's monthly salary ranges from $9,000 to $12,000, with additional stipends and allowances. Ella, that's very thorough research. Is this the standard level of blind dating now? This is intelligence warfare. Intelligence warfare. But even with that, I still wouldn't compare to Mr. Swift, right? Ella said. That was true. Salaries varied greatly between different military ranks. Looking at the young Alpha in front of him, the promising officer he had taken an interest in, Alex said, "You will have it all in the future." That kind of sounded like a sales pitch. No, it was probably just polite encouragement. Ella waited for his answers to the remaining questions, ready to poke holes in them. As for my family, Alex paused briefly before saying, "I'm the only one. My parents passed away many years ago." Ella, what? The average lifespan of a person in the interstellar era was 150 years. It was nearly impossible to guess someone's exact age by appearance alone. Swift looked to be in his prime, which meant his parents hadn't died of old age. That meant illness or an accident. I am such an idiot. Ella mentally smacked herself. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, feeling deeply regretful. She actually had no parents either. She was an orphan, picked up and raised by her older sister. But she had grown up with her sister and brother taking care of her. Though life had been a bit tight, she had been happy. She had family. Her sister and brother were her family. But Mr. Swift's situation was different from hers. "It's fine. It was a long time ago." Alex's voice was calm. He wasn't someone who needed comfort from a junior. He continued answering. "No past relationships. As for why I'm single," Alex found it difficult to explain. If he had to say, it was simply because he had never thought about it. If not for the system notifying him of an unprecedentedly high compatibility match, he wouldn't be here now. "Maybe because I never met a suitable match," Alex said. That sounded way too much like her sister's talk about fate. Ella couldn't help but ask, "You believe in genetic compatibility?" Mr. Swift had the look of a rational elite. He wouldn't actually believe in this, would he? Alex stared at her in silence for a moment before answering firmly. "Yes." Well, that made things a little tricky. Ella hadn't expected him to still believe in genetic compatibility after everything. According to her sister, their match percentage was high. She wasn't sure exactly how high. Maybe 80%? Anything above 65% was considered a strong match. But that didn't mean much. With the entire Federation's population, there were always higher matches out there. What if you meet an Alpha with an even higher compatibility score? Ella asked. Alpha? Alex was briefly confused but still answered. There won't be a higher match. Ella knew that statistically, even if there were 10,000 people with an 80% match, actually meeting one in a lifetime was rare. I mean, hypothetically. If. Just assume it exists. Alex frowned. I don't accept that assumption. If I have to assume it, all I can say is that I will stay loyal to my feelings, to my partner, and to my family, just as I am loyal to my country. Alex's expression was serious. Ella, you don't have to make it sound like a military oath. Wait, did he just assume she was his partner already? And family? Huh? Was this the kind of "I've just met you, but I've already planned how many kids we'll have" situation? Ella's gaze unconsciously drifted downward, below Swift's chest. This was too. Her ears burned slightly, and she felt like the room temperature had gone up. The faint sweetness in the air became more noticeable. Ella suddenly felt a strange itch in her teeth, a desire to bite something. She pressed her sharp canines together and reached for her drink to cool down, but then she noticed. Swift looked even hotter than she did. The usually cold and composed Swift now had a faint flush under his eyes, as if he were tipsy. His gloved hand loosened his collar slightly, his breathing heavier than before. When he looked up, his gaze was hazy, carrying both warmth and a trace of apology. Pardon me, the room temperature is a bit high. Swift's voice was low, his words slow, the tail end of his sentence curling like a hook. No, yeah, totally. Ella dazedly agreed. In her mind, all she could think was, damn, that voice was dangerous. No wonder Omegas were so drawn to Alphas. Who could possibly resist this? Was the room really that hot? Ella felt the heat too, a restless sensation rising within her. This was the most high-end hotel, one that could even operate in space. There was no way they'd be stingy about something like air conditioning, right? Ella glanced around Swift's surroundings, trying to locate the faulty cooling system. But before she could find anything, her gaze was drawn back to Swift himself. Mr. Swift had his eyes lowered, his brows slightly furrowed, as if trying to suppress the heat through sheer willpower. But it was clearly futile. In the end, he raised a hand and unfastened the top button of his collar, revealing the slender curve of his neck. In an instant, the sweet scent in the air intensified. It was a sweetness laced with the sharp tang of smoke and iron, a scent of war and blood. It was the kind of pheromone that would make omegas tremble in fear and even overwhelm other alphas, making them too intimidated to approach. But Ella thought it smelled good. She instinctively sought the source of the scent, her gaze settling on the side of Swift's neck. Omegas usually wore scent patches when going out, and the more cautious ones would even wear collars or scarves. But Swift had nothing covering his neck. It felt like an invitation. She wanted to bite him. Slap, slap, slap. Ella smacked her own face to snap out of it. Wait. Something was very wrong. Her current state, feeling overheated and restless, was exactly how an alpha entering susceptibility due to an omega's heat would react. And Swift's condition looked exactly like what they had learned in biology class about an omega's heat cycle. And the scent in the air. Oh, hell no. An omega in heat. Ella shot up from her seat, utterly flustered. Omegas had fixed heat cycles. The shortest lasted a few days, the longest about a week. Because their cycles were predictable, omegas usually took time off in advance or used suppressants beforehand to avoid causing chaos. But there was one exception. If an omega encountered an alpha they liked, one with an extremely high compatibility, there was a chance they could enter heat on the spot. And clearly, she was that high compatibility alpha. Ella froze in place. Her brain went into overdrive. What should an alpha do when faced with an omega going into heat? Wrong answer. Fight them. Mark them. Correct answer. 1. Administer a suppressant. 2. If no suppressant is available, or if it fails, perform a temporary mark. 3. She had slept through that part of biology class, so she had no idea. Ella clutched her head. She felt like a confused Psyduck. It wasn't her fault. She was a mecha combat major. Military exams didn't cover this. Whatever. The first step was to find a suppressant. But alpha and omega suppressants were different and not interchangeable. Ella wasn't sensitive to pheromones, and she definitely didn't carry suppressants around. She had nothing on her. Ella had no choice but to ask. Mr. Swift, do you have a suppressant with you? Alex had also realized something was wrong with his body, but he hadn't associated it with a susceptibility episode. The moment Ella mentioned suppressant, realization dawned on him, along with shock. He had always had perfect control over his pheromones. He had never lost control before. This was the first time. Fortunately, he had a suppressant in his storage button. Alex touched the small device on his sleeve and retrieved a vial of clear liquid. Rolling up his sleeve, he injected the suppressant into his vein. His movements were swift and precise. The only sign of instability was the faint tremor in his fingers when he set the empty syringe down. Ella let out a breath of relief as she watched Swift administer the suppressant, only to be immediately hit by an even richer, stronger scent of his pheromones. Wait, why wasn't it working? Alex's mind was spinning. His control over his body was slipping further, yet the heat inside him only kept rising. His breath was scorching. Is the suppressant expired? That was the only explanation Ella could think of. Hold on, I'll order another one. Express delivery, it'll be here soon. As she spoke, she quickly opened her terminal. No. The military distributed suppressants every month. There was no way they'd be expired. Alex shook his head, trying to stay lucid. He retrieved another suppressant and injected it again. The cold liquid flowed into his veins, but his body didn't cool down at all. Instead, the heat only burned hotter. Sweat gathered at his temples. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a third dose. The pheromone concentration in the suite had already reached a maddening level. Thankfully, Ella had always been insensitive to pheromones. She was still able to stay clear-headed, unlike most alphas in susceptibility who would have already lost all reason and turned into beasts ruled by desire. Seeing Swift reach for a third injection, Ella stepped forward and pressed down on his hand. No, you can't inject anymore. Suppressants weren't some harmless saline solution you could use as much as you wanted. Even saline had a limit. Not to mention the suppressant, it was either expired or had undergone some unknown chemical change. Who knew what harm it might cause? She tried to take the suppressant from Swift's hand, but he resisted slightly. To calm him down, Ella imitated the way her sister soothed their pet furball, stroking Swift's back gently and saying, "Good boy." Alex jolted like he'd been electrocuted, immediately loosening his grip. Ella seized the chance to take the suppressant away. When she looked down, she saw Swift staring at her in a daze. In heat, Swift had shed his usual cold and dignified demeanor. He looked a little slow, like she could do anything to him. Ella quickly stomped down on that dangerous thought. She was a responsible, self-disciplined alpha. Yes, she occasionally entertained world-ending scenarios, but she really was a responsible alpha with principles. "Mr. Swift?" She tried to rouse him. His eyes were unfocused, his consciousness hazy. When his gaze finally settled on her face, she spoke quickly. "You're in serious condition, and you can't take another suppressant. I need to give you a temporary mark." This hotel was quiet, but it was heavily guarded by alpha security personnel. There were even 2 stationed right at the door, as if they were guarding a high-security zone. Unlike Ella, they weren't immune to pheromones. If Swift's scent kept spreading, it could trigger every alpha nearby into susceptibility. That would be a disaster, a headline-making catastrophe. Do you understand me? A temporary mark means, I need to kiss you. Ella lowered her voice as she leaned in. A kiss was the simplest way to create a temporary mark. Alex was dizzy, barely able to process her words. The alpha was too close. The subtle yet distinct presence of her pheromones made his body tremble almost imperceptibly. Alpha and omega pheromones attracted each other. Alphas, on the other hand, instinctively rejected each other's scents. Ella burned bright like fire, but her pheromones were cool. Like shattered ice clinking in a wine glass, fruity sweetness blended with the rich depth of ice wine, intoxicating and smooth. Alex, who had only ever drunk plain water and mild tea, felt instantly lightheaded. Somewhere in his dazed mind, he caught a single word. Kiss. His gaze locked onto the alpha's lips. His Adam's apple bobbed. His mouth felt unbearably dry. His lips parted slightly. To Ella, that looked like silent consent, an invitation. She met Swift's gaze, then slowly leaned down. Her right hand covered the pulse point on his neck, blocking it with her fingers to keep herself from acting on dangerous instincts. Her left hand gripped Swift's lean waist. Then, she kissed him, and let her pheromones flow into him. Cool, intoxicating pheromones poured into Alex. His mind went completely blank. The exchange of body heat, the intake of an alpha's pheromones, it calmed an omega in heat. By the time Alex emerged from that intoxicated haze, it was over. He had no idea how much time had passed. His clothes were neat. The alpha sat across from him, calm as ever. The bottle on the table was empty. "Are you all right, Mr. Swift?" Ella asked. I'm fine." Alex was startled by his own voice, low and hoarse. His lips and tongue felt foreign to him, like they weren't his own. Realizing he probably looked terrible right now, he quickly averted his gaze, straightening his collar as if to regain some composure. Seeing that rare flicker of panic in Swift's expression, Ella hurried to reassure him. "Relax. It was just a temporary mark." She swore she hadn't done anything else. She had even covered his neck for him. Hearing the words "temporary mark" from Ella, Alex's expression turned particularly strange. He focused on his body's condition. The raging pheromones inside him had calmed. That was the effect of a temporary mark. For a brief moment, Alex's gaze wavered. Everyone knew that only an alpha could suppress an omega's pheromones. Similarly, only an omega could soothe an alpha. He had already thought it was unbelievable to have such a high compatibility with an alpha. Reality was even more unexpected. He had been marked by an alpha. "Mr. Swift?" Ella waved a hand in front of Alex's face. Alex looked at her, his expression filled with deep confusion and uncertainty. "Are you really an alpha?" "Of course." Ella had no idea why he would ask such a thing. She guessed. "Did you think I was a beta?" That didn't make sense. She didn't look like a beta at all. Besides, betas had low compatibility with both alphas and omegas. They couldn't perform pheromone soothing. No, Alex would never mistake her for a beta. She was too sharp, too dazzling, her presence was too intense. This was nothing like the balanced and ordinary nature of a beta. That kind of personality was usually found among top-tier alphas. But there was one exception. Above alphas, there was an even rarer, more unique sex. Alex's gaze on Ella grew even more uncertain and suspicious. Ella felt uncomfortable under his stare and regretfully realized there was no way for her to prove her gender. I only finished my secondary gender differentiation a week ago. My genetic test results haven't come out yet. Honestly, the Federation's efficiency was ridiculously slow. Ella muttered to herself, then lifted her chin with a confident smile. But I'm definitely an alpha. In any case, the mark will hold. She reassured him. You don't have to worry about it wearing off. After this, you can go for a checkup, get a new suppressant, or find another alpha to renew the mark. Ella swallowed the last part of her sentence. Maybe it was just alpha possessiveness acting up. No alpha liked seeing an omega they had marked except another alpha's mark. Even if it was just temporary. That kind of thinking wasn't good. She and Mr. Swift were from completely different worlds. Their lives were never meant to intersect. This blind date was nothing more than a brief, accidental crossing of paths. Once it ended, everything would go back to the way it was. Unexpectedly, Ella felt a hint of reluctance. But after what had happened, the date had to end early. Once she confirmed that someone would be coming to pick up Mr. Swift, Ella straightened herself up, said goodbye, and left. Stepping out of the suite, she headed to settle the bill, planning to cover both her and Swift's share. That was what an alpha should do. Then the security escorting her informed her Eternal Sea Hotel belonged to Mr. Swift. Ella, she had known Mr. Swift was wealthy. She hadn't expected this level of wealth. No wonder he needed a document just to keep track of his assets. Thinking back to how quiet the hotel had been, it now seemed more like a private reservation. Or a full lockdown. They really weren't from the same world. Stepping out of Eternal Sea and into the sunlight, Ella still felt dazed. She turned back for one last look at the grand structure, towering like a cosmic spaceship. Her resolve hardened. One day, she would have her own ship. For now, she'd catch the public transport. Aboard the Eternal Sea spacecraft, Alex sat alone in a chair by the massive floor-to-ceiling starry window. He had been in this position for a long time. Not because he was lost in deep thought or making some critical decision, he simply couldn't ignore the pheromones surrounding him. After a long silence, Alex gave in. He opened his terminal and sent a message to his adjutant, who had just seen Ella off. Bring me a uniform. Full set. The adjutant's mind immediately filled with dramatic late-night drama scenarios. Meeting a highly compatible blind date and then needing a full change of clothes afterward, that was certainly something to speculate about. But the problem was, that blind date was an alpha. Regardless of the mental storm he was experiencing, the adjutant still followed orders, requesting a full military uniform and delivering it to the marshal. Except he never even made it inside. The moment the door opened, an overwhelming wave of 3S-ranked pheromones crashed over him, nearly driving him to his knees. The thick scent of gunpowder filled the air, laced with a faint trace of blood, as if the very essence of war had seeped into the room. That was the marshal's pheromones. And mixed within them was something else. Something entirely unfamiliar. Like a glacier of pure ice, carrying a biting chill and an overpowering dizziness that stole control of the body. Alphas had sharp senses. Even from the inner chamber, Alex could hear his adjutant stumbling, unsteady footsteps. He knew his pheromones had always been oppressive to ordinary alphas. But his adjutant had served him for years, and never once had he reacted this badly. The only new factor was Ella's pheromones. A flicker of thought passed through Alex's eyes. Then he spoke, instructing the adjutant to hand the uniform to a delivery bot. The adjutant, as if granted amnesty, quickly retreated. A small hovering drone floated into the room, carrying the uniform. Alex changed into his military attire, storing his old clothes in a space button. He was just about to leave the room when he suddenly paused. His gaze shifted to the reflection in the glass. A streak of red stood out at the corner of his mouth. Alex instinctively raised a gloved hand, fingers brushing against it. A smear of crimson spread across the pure white glove, along with a scent. Snow and wine. Rich, intoxicating, and unmistakable. Alex froze for a moment. Then, realization struck. Captain Ella's lip balm. His expression flickered. Under the cover of his dark hair, the tips of his ears burned red. After a long pause, he pulled out a handkerchief and carefully wiped the lip balm from his lips. Then, he folded the handkerchief neatly and sealed it inside a plastic pouch. Expression unreadable, Alex left the room. He handed the sealed pouch to his adjutant. "Take this to Dr. Taylor for analysis," he ordered in a low voice. His gloved fingers lingered for a second, rubbing the spot where the scent had clung to them. He thought about Ella's parting words. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "And make another trip to the gene data center. There's something I need to check." Ella had spent the entire way home thinking about how to explain the failed blind date to her sister. And Omega's heat was a private matter, not something she could bring up. That meant she had to stick to her original plan. "You're saying that Mr. Swift wasn't interested in you?" Zelda frowned slightly, looking confused. Ella mumbled through a mouthful of food, head down as she shoveled rice into her mouth. She hadn't eaten much all day, she was starving. If she'd known Eternal Sea was Swift's own business, she wouldn't have held back. She would have eaten as much as she wanted. "You look like a starving ghost reincarnated." Even an Omega would be scared off. Across from her, Gavin spoke in a tone of mock disgust. "What are you saying?" Ella kicked the leg of his chair under the table. While he scrambled to steady himself, she took the last 2 chicken wings from his bowl. One went into Zelda's bowl. "Here, sis, you eat." The other, she devoured instantly, biting straight through the bone. Gavin cursed under his breath. Zelda glanced at the two of them but still couldn't make sense of it. A high compatibility means there's an instinctive attraction between you. Why wouldn't he be interested? "Guess we just weren't a good match," Ella replied casually. "In what way?" Zelda pressed. How was she supposed to answer that? Ella knew her sister well, too well. If she tried to lie, Zelda would see through her in an instant. The more she said, the more suspicious it would seem. She racked her brain, searching for a way to move past the topic quickly. Gavin glanced at her and spoke up. "It's because of her pheromones." Zelda turned to him, puzzled. "Ella's pheromones are too cold and sharp. A lot of Omegas would find them intimidating. Being around an alpha like that would feel stressful." "That's exactly it." Ella immediately nodded, shooting her brother a subtle look of approval. Zelda seemed convinced, even going so far as to comfort Ella. "Pheromones are natural. It's not your fault. Don't feel bad about it. Some people like cold pheromones, just like some people like ice cream." As she spoke, she placed the chicken wing from her bowl into Ella's. Sis, you're the best." Gavin turned away, unable to watch. He thought to himself, Ella's pheromones and ice cream? Not even close. No ice cream would ever freeze someone's bones to the point of breaking. That night, after making sure her sister was asleep, Ella slipped out of the house. A group of round, fluffy creatures trailed at her feet. Having just graduated from the military academy, she wasn't used to having so much free time. There wasn't much training equipment at home either, so she had to go out to get some exercise. As soon as she reached the ground floor, she caught a faint scent of smoke. Ella turned her head and saw a familiar figure leaning against the wall, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. "Air it out before you go back in," she frowned. Her sister couldn't stand the smell. Cough. Caught in the act, Gavin quickly stubbed out the cigarette, patted himself down, and spread his hands as if to say, "All gone." Ella withdrew her gaze and walked past him. Gavin called out, "About the blind date." Ella stopped, waiting for him to continue. But then, he hesitated. Instead, he said, "I've saved up some money over the years, enough for a down payment on a 3-bedroom in District 10. In a little while, we'll have a bigger, brighter place. We'll move the whole family there. You'll meet new Omegas." Ella was still reeling from the fact that he'd managed to save up so much without anyone noticing. Then she registered his last sentence. He was trying to comfort her. They all knew Omegas don't like her pheromones was just an excuse. Between a highly compatible Alpha and Omega, there could be no pheromone rejection. In fact, they would be drawn to each other's pheromones. Judging by Gavin's words, he must have thought the Omega had rejected her because of their family's financial situation. Well, This was an unexpected misunderstanding, and such a roundabout way of showing concern. It was true that family circumstances played a role, but that was her reason for giving up, not Swift's. Besides, her brother had no idea just how vast the gap was between their family and Swift. Still, there was no need to bring it up and dampen his spirits. Gavin's way of comforting her, she appreciated it. "Bro, you're the best. I promise I won't steal your chicken wings anymore," Ella said sincerely. Gavin chuckled, then added, "You said it. No take-backs. All yours." Ella thought to herself, "The wings are yours. I'll just take the drumsticks, the thighs, the neck, the giblets." Gavin, unaware of the scheming in her heart, moved on to another concern. "By the way, what are you doing out this late?" "Walking the dogs." Ella nudged the fluffy creatures at her feet. Chirp. One of the creatures tumbled forward, bumping into another, letting out a tiny, bird-like sound. Chirp, chirp. The others followed suit, their soft voices filling the quiet night. They were naturally quiet creatures. Even at this hour, they didn't disturb the peace. "Walking the dogs cough, walking furball beasts?" Gavin corrected himself. "Yep, it's more fun at night." Gavin thought, what's so fun about wandering around in the middle of the night? Especially in a place like this. The security in the area was terrible. He frowned. Then again, considering Ella's combat skills, if anything did happen, she wouldn't be the one in danger. "Fine. Be careful. Come back soon." Yeah. Ella waved him off, leading her fluffy companions away. District 13 was technically part of the capital planet, but the planet was massive. Development varied wildly from district to district. Far from the central regions, District 13 was chaotic, full of all kinds of people. Before she left for university, Ella used to patrol the nearby streets every night, clearing out the trash. Her usual route covered the roads her sister took to and from work. She made sure they were absolutely safe. For a time, a rumor had spread through the area. A mysterious alpha girl appeared at midnight. With monstrous strength, she could punch a man straight into a wall. If you lost the ability to fight back and collapsed, her terrifying furball beasts would tear you apart. Of course, Ella insisted those were just rumors. She never damaged public property. And her furballs usually didn't tear people apart, just everything else, like clothes. Since she had chosen the capital's military academy to avoid tuition fees and earn a high scholarship, she hadn't been able to come back often. It had been a long time since she'd taken a midnight walk. Stepping onto the familiar, narrow streets again, she actually felt a little excited. As Ella happily began her night patrol on the other side, at the military district hospital, Alex reviewed the data provided by the doctor. Level S, age 19, height 175 centimeters, weight. Wait a minute, isn't she a captain? And she graduated with honors this year, 19? The adjutant couldn't help but say. Exceptional results. Graduated early, Alex replied casually. In reality, as soon as his eyes caught her age, they flicked away quickly, as though stung. Alex had always known that Ella was young. Just graduated this year, very young. But he hadn't had a clear concept of exactly how young until now. 19 years old. She was a full generation younger than him. That age gap, in the context of the average lifespan of 150 years, wasn't that significant, but still, it made Alex feel uncomfortable. Especially when he recalled their kiss with the comforting mark. It felt almost like he had entrapped a young, naive alpha. No, not an alpha. Alex's eyes fell to the gender section. Enigma. His earlier guess had been confirmed. The room fell silent. After a long pause, the adjutant finally found his voice. Enigma. That's the gender associated with mania, control freaks, antisocial personalities, and war fanatics, right? Enigma, the fourth gender, above alpha, beta, and omega. Extremely rare and special. Throughout history, there had only been a handful of them. Each had left a significant legacy, all with extremely negative evaluations. Alex furrowed his brow slightly. She's not like that. Though he hadn't spent much time with Ella, Alex was certain she wasn't like that. Mania, control freak, antisocial personality, war fanatic. He couldn't connect any of those terms with Ella. In the brief encounter, the only thing remotely out of the ordinary was when she kissed him, she had gripped his neck. That move hinted at a bit of possessiveness, but it didn't make him uncomfortable. On the contrary, there was a sense of unspoken safety, making him willingly offer his neck to her hand. Recalling that feeling, Alex's gaze drifted. Dr. Taylor, who had been silent up until now, adjusted his glasses and spoke calmly. It's unreasonable to judge someone based solely on their gender. But historically, every one of those few individuals was a top-tier genius and a madman of their time. She will be an unstable factor. According to the Federation's usual approach, she should be controlled first before anything else. Does the Marshal have any concerns? The doctor asked. The adjutant suddenly recalled something and turned to look at the Marshal, his face filled with shock and panic, his tongue almost tripping over itself. She offended the Marshal. The doctor looked up in surprise. Stop talking nonsense. Alex shot a look at the adjutant, signaling him to shut up. It was just a temporary mark. Alex spoke casually as if it didn't matter. The doctor, unable to resist the urge to explain, added. Enigma doesn't have temporary marks. Enigma was an enigma, a mystery. They weren't affected by any alpha, beta, or omega pheromones and had no biological weaknesses. They could mark any other gender, including the top gender of the three, alpha. Enigma didn't have temporary marks. Every mark was permanent, leaving a lifelong imprint. No one could overwrite an enigma's mark. Nothing could erase an enigma's mark. It's a permanent mark, the doctor affirmed. After the doctor finished speaking, he realized something. Wait a minute, that enigma marked the Marshal? Gave the Marshal a permanent mark? What? The Marshal is the strongest alpha. Level 3S. How could he be marked by an S level? The adjutant grabbed the doctor's shoulders, shaking him. Aren't you a doctor? Hurry up and remove the mark. I'm a doctor, not an enigma. How am I supposed to remove an enigma's mark? Theoretically, only another enigma could remove it, but there can't be two of them in the same era. Enough. Feng Luo, step back. Alex pinched the bridge of his nose in frustration and stopped the adjutant's medical panic. The adjutant reluctantly let go, patting the doctor's shoulder to smooth out the wrinkles, pretending like nothing had happened. This mark, what kind of impact will it have? Alex asked. Same as with an omega. Dr. Taylor shrugged, then realized he was speaking in front of the Marshal and quickly straightened up. An enigma can mark an alpha as their exclusive omega, literally. In others' perception, you'll still be the top alpha. But in her presence, you'll become like all the marked omegas. Dr. Taylor knew no alpha could accept such a shift, but he didn't know how to comfort the Marshal. He could only tell him what he knew. You'll become unable to leave her. Every one of your sensitive periods will turn into something like an omega's heat cycle, craving her pheromones, craving her presence. You might even get pregnant. Pregnant? Alex's hand instinctively moved to his abdomen, his expression shocked. The word, when applied to an alpha, felt completely out of place, utterly mismatched. It was like the stars had reversed, the sun and moon were out of order, fish swimming through the air and people breathing underwater. How could an alpha get pregnant? The adjutant exclaimed in fear, an alpha doesn't even have the organs for it. There's no womb to carry an embryo. The doctor reassured him, don't worry, it will develop. Was that supposed to be comforting? Don't say such a horrifying story in such a calm tone. Marshal, I'll go capture that enigma. She was just marked today. There must be a way to fix this. The adjutant volunteered. Capture her? Alex, sitting in the chair, looked up coldly at the adjutant. How do you plan to capture a Federation citizen? Just because she gave a temporary mark out of kindness when someone else needed help. Enigmas didn't have temporary marks. But in the public's mind, a kiss was seen as a temporary mark. Ella had just recently undergone her differentiation, and the Federation's database had yet to update her genetic data. Even Ella herself didn't know her true gender. She didn't have the intention of fully marking him. You couldn't convict her for something like this. Seeing that the adjutant seemed still unconvinced, Alex reminded him. This is a law-based society, and that's a Federation citizen you're sworn to protect. Don't do something foolish. Then what do we do? Just watch as she binds you in this way. The adjutant couldn't bear it. Alex, who didn't have a deep experience with being marked, was much more laid back about the whole situation. How many omegas have been marked by alphas? If this is binding, then all those omegas should have their glands removed. That idea is very dangerous, Marshall. Dr. Taylor couldn't help but speak up. There was a mad enigma in history who advocated for the removal of all AO glands, believing them to be an evolutionary defect, a fatal weakness. Of course, that enigma ultimately failed. However, his ideology persisted, and there were still many groups that follow the belief that glands are evil and pheromones are a sin. The Federation government finds it quite troublesome. Remove the glands? A thought flashed through the adjutant's mind, but he quickly shook it off. What's the difference between an alpha without pheromone glands and being castrated? The only solution was to deal with that enigma. History has already proven that every enigma is an unstable factor and cannot be left unchecked. She hasn't fully developed yet. This is the best time to intervene. The adjutant no longer dared to suggest capturing the enigma and waited for the marshal's orders. Alex remained firm, still believing that Ella's rights as a citizen should be respected. She's a graduate of the Capital Military Academy. She'll be entering the 1st Army in September this year. Once she's under the military's watch, she'll be safe. Until then, just keep an eye on her general movements. Don't interfere with her life. And as for the Federation Gene Data Center, hide the data that needs to be hidden, modify the data that needs to be modified. If Ella's enigma identity were to be revealed, it would surely cause a huge uproar. Due to historical reasons, the general public has a natural distrust or even fear of enigmas. Of course, there would also be extreme fanaticism among those who worship them. The government's response would be more complicated. Alex understood the politicians well. The conservative right wing tends to crush any threat in its cradle. The radical and greedy left wing is more interested in using the power for their own gain. Whether it's the government's intentions or the pressure from public opinion, it would bring huge trouble to Ella. Until Ella has the ability to protect herself or the public's perception changes, hiding her gender is the best form of protection. Alex decided to intervene and keep Ella's enigma identity under wraps for now. The adjutant understood the marshal's intent, but didn't understand why he was so protective of that enigma. And, can we really hide it? Alex didn't see it as an issue. Aside from the mark, there's not much difference between an enigma and a top-tier alpha. Once she's in the military, we'll arrange for her to have a separate dorm. What if you get pregnant? The adjutant asked. What if you get pregnant? What if you get pregnant? What if you get pregnant? Alex's mind suddenly went blank.